Welcome. We are recording this session. Thank you for being here. This is MNA's overview of the Coronavirus Relief Fund interim and final reporting process. So for those grants that you receive from the state of Montana, to make sure that you're filling out the report in the correct way, providing the correct amount of information, the right information, and setting yourself up for success so that we don't have to have any sort of a payback on that program. My name is Adam Jesperson. I'm the Director of Innovation here at the Montana Nonprofit Association. Joining me are my colleagues, Michael Hale and Shelby Rogala. They're going to be monitoring the chat and organizing and filtering questions as we go through this. As we work through this, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. We're going to provide some program overview at the outset, and then the rest of this time is just a chance to ask questions as detailed or as broad as you need. And we will be here for as long as it takes to get those answered. We at MNA have been engaged with the state of Montana in this process to do exactly what we're doing, providing an overview, and also to sort of be that first wave of question takers. So if we can answer the question, we will, but we also have a direct line to state representatives. So if we're not able to answer the questions, we will get them up to the state of Montana, and on our COVID relief page, which we have a link to in our presentation, will probably be in the chat here shortly. We are keeping a running list of frequently asked questions and those answers to those questions that we have. So we're trying to get information out to you as timely and as accurately as we can. And if we don't have the answers to your questions here today, we are working hard to get those as quickly as possible. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts of this process, of the reporting process here, I wanted to ground us just in some terminology, because I think sometimes we get hung up on some of the new acronyms that we've been given in the last 9 months. Back in summer of 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act. That's the big umbrella. That was the hundreds of billions. I think it was more than $1 trillion relief package. It had a lot of different components into that. That was unemployment assistance, funding for health systems, corporate aid, a lot more. It also included the PPP loans for small businesses and nonprofits, which probably most of us on this call availed ourselves of. In addition to those buckets of funding, there was $1.2 billion that every state received that they could spend as they saw fit for state aid, for coronavirus relief for their state. From that $1.2 billion, the state of Montana created the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which had a number of different grant programs within it, from social service grants for nonprofits in general. There was support for food banks, there was support for housing, for childcare, live entertainment, stay connected, business adaptability, small business sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. There were a number of programs that were built into that. Those cumulatively make up the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is part of the CARES Act. I give you all of that because there are some regulations and rules that go into the reporting that has to do with CARES Act funding, the big umbrella, and also with just state coronavirus relief fund funding. So as we're talking about different terms, keep this hierarchy in mind so that we don't get things crosswise as we're discussing. We today are talking about, so, within the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the state of Montana divvied up those grants to different state agencies. So all of those grants that were mainly offered to nonprofit organizations are administered under the Department of Health and Human Services. They include rounds 1 and 2 of the social service grant, the school-age child care grant, food bank and food pantry assistance, stay connected, and safeguard access. Those are the grant programs that we're talking about here today that are administered through the Department of Health and Human Services. They have put out the reporting process for these grants. There are other programs in the Coronavirus Relief Fund umbrella that are not covered here, although the reporting process will probably look pretty similar. You are required to submit a final report at a minimum, if not an interim report, for each of the grants that you have received funding for. You're required to do an interim report for each of the grants that are listed up here on this slide. the one grant that some of you may have received that does not require a final report is the Business Adaptability Grant. That was the grant that that was for different sort of public health equipment, such as PPE, hand sanitizing stations, laptop computers that allow your employees to work from home, et cetera, et cetera. That was a program that was on a reimbursement model where you made the purchases, you submitted your receipts to the state of Montana, and you were reimbursed for what you had already paid. Because it's a reimbursement model, there's no report that's due for that program. Every other program listed on this slide requires that you submit an individual report for that accounts for the funds for that grant. The grant funds that you received, you're able to use for expenses that go back to March 1st of 2020 through December 30th of 2020. So even if you may have only received the grant in early October or whenever it was that you actually received the funding, you're able to use that for coronavirus mitigation expenses going back to March 1st of 2020. So that's one thing that people had questions on. Do I have to use it for expenses from now moving forward from when I received the grant? No, you can use it for expenses going back to March 1st. Any funds that are not expended and accounted for by December 30th of 2020 are going to be required to be returned to the state of Montana and then returned to the federal government. That's per federal statute. The CARES Act says that all funds have to be expended by December 30th of 2020. So everyone's hands are tied on that as of the moment, and there's no grace on that. All funds have to be spent by December 30th. Whatever is not spent is going to be required to be returned. Here's where that hierarchy is important. You cannot use funds. You cannot double dip or overlap what you are counting as expenses for your coronavirus relief fund grants. They can't double dip. You can't overlap those expenses with other CARES Act programs, such as the Paycheck Protection Program. So if you went out and got a Paycheck Protection Program loan back in March, April, May for 8 or 12 weeks of payroll, whatever it was, you cannot fill out your report now saying I used my CRF grant, my social service grant, whatever the CRF grant was, for payroll expenses for that same period. You have to be able to tie it to unique, each bit of CRF funding and each bit of CARES Act funding has to be tied to unique expenses for your organization from March 1st through December 30th. You all, if you're on the call, you probably got an email from the state of Montana saying you have an interim report due on November 16th for one or more of the CRF grants that you have received. Interim reports are due on November 16th. The final reports are due by January 31st of 2021. There are some, which we'll get into in a second, there are some additional things that you need to include in your final report than what you have to do in your interim report. The interim report is just sort of a status update to the state of Montana that says, here's how much we've spent to date. Here's how much we have remaining. Yes, we plan on spending it by the end of the year. No, we're not going to get it all spent. We're going to have a payback. And here's where we've spent the money to date. It's pretty straightforward and pretty simplistic. The final report is all of that. But it actually says how much exactly did you spend. And then depending on the level of funding you had, there's some reports that you have to submit with that, some documentation you have to submit with that. If you have, for the individual grant that you received that you're being required to report on right now, if you have spent all of those funds as of today, you can click the button at the top of the report that says this is a final report, not interim, but this is a final report, and you can complete it as if it's a final report, submit it, and be done. If your funds were spent as of today, you can submit that one report now and be done with this. The report itself does say how much was spent or obligated by September 30th. If you've spent all the funds as of today, disregard that and go with the amount that you've spent today. if it's all of the funds, and submit this as if you're submitting your final report. We got guidance from the state on that says that's what they want. They want to try to close these out as quickly as possible right now. So if you're done and you can account for all the funds and you've spent all the funds appropriately and accurately, this can be your final report and you can be done with that report. If the total amount of funds that you have received from the Coronavirus Relief Fund effort, that's the 1.2 from the state of Montana, that includes all those different grant sources or those grant programs. If the total amount of those funds exceeds $50,000 for your organization, you are required to submit a detailed general ledger report that details all of the transactions, all of the spending of those grant funds for a general ledger report for each individual grant that you have received. If you are below that $50,000 threshold in cumulative funds out of the Coronavirus Relief Fund, you do not have to submit a general ledger report. You can just fill out the report that's online, fill out the form, and certify that it's accurate and be done. The general ledger report is only due with your final report. Whether that final report is the one that you're going to do now as your one shot, your one report, or if you're waiting until this January 31st. You do not need to submit a GL for your interim report if you still have funds to spend or if you're not ready to close out your grant. The GL is only due for your final report. Also, considering many of you received 2 rounds of that social service grant. The first round was for up to $10,000. The second round was for up to 10% of your annual expenses. That is, even though you received two payments, consider that one grant. So if you're doing your report for the social service grant, it's one report for both checks you received, both payments you received, the cumulative sum of both payments in one report. Consider it 2 installments of one grant. Also know that when we say the general ledger report, we do not mean an income statement or a P&L, or profit and loss statement. The general ledger report is a very specific report that you can pull out of QuickBooks or whatever accounting software you use that shows the detailed transactions, the ins and outs of the funds that you have received. So it shows that you've received the money. It shows all the individual transactions that reduce the amount of money that you have remaining, and it shows the balance at the bottom, the zero balance at the bottom. You must be able to submit a separate GL report for each Coronavirus Relief Fund grant you received. We don't want your GL for all of your expenses, or the state doesn't want the GL for all of your expenses from March 1st through December 30th. They just want the expenses that are tied to the individual grants you received, and they want a unique GL for each of the individual grants that you've received. The state does also not want to see a GL for Paycheck Protection Program expenditures. So it's just that bucket of funding that's under the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund effort. You must have separate reports for each grant. You can tell the difference in the grants by what's called the CFDA number. You can find the CFDA number for the grant you received either on the grant contract, or you can find it at the top of the interim report that you're filling out. It'll say right there, the CFDA number for this grant is MT, whatever. It'll be listed right up there at the top. As an example, this is what the general ledger report might look like. This is just a quick example. You can see that you have expense, individual expense, individual expense, individual income, individual credit, balance at the bottom. So it's going to look something like this, where it has individual transactions for how you spent the funds, which will match the amount in each category that you put onto that final report or the interim report that you're submitting. So consult the contract that you signed, electronically signed, when you accepted the grant, that says which funds are eligible and which are ineligible for funding under the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Whatever's listed as ineligible, make sure you're aware of those. If it's not listed as ineligible and it is considered an expense that you undertook to mitigate impacts of COVID to your organization, which includes unemployment, includes having to lay people off, those are probably going to be allowable expenses. There are some restrictions on those, but for the most part, if it's not listed as ineligible, and if we haven't mentioned here that it's ineligible, if we haven't heard somewhere else, then it's probably going to be okay. Some examples: the most common eligible expenses are payroll. When we're talking about payroll, it's wages and benefits. So it can include not just the wages of the employee, but it can include retirement contributions, health insurance, other ancillary benefits you provide to your employees. It cannot include any local, state, or federal payroll taxes. So you want to show just gross wages, and you cannot pay for, using CRF funds, any payroll taxes. Other common expenses include equipment. By equipment, we mean capital equipment. So these are non-expendable property that have a useful life of greater than 1 year and a unit cost of more than $5,000. A capital asset, something that you're putting on your balance sheet. The key to this is that you can only, we're just talking about expenses from March 1st through December 30th. So you can only use that portion of that capital expenditure that is the portion for 2020. So if it's going to be a capital asset with, say, a useful life of 3 years, you can only use the value of that asset that's being tied as an expense, a depreciated expense, in 2020. Supplies, consumables, materials costing less than $5,000, which includes PPE and other health and safety supplies. Those are considered eligible expenses. There are other operating expenses that you can put towards the expenses for CRF funds: rent, utilities, training for employees. Like the school-age childcare grants had a requirement to offset tuition and fees that parents were paying for childcare. That could be included. There are a couple key things that you cannot include. You cannot prepay 2021 expenses, meaning you cannot prepay 12 months of your mortgage or insurances, and you cannot subgrant funds. So if you received funds and you wanted to offer them to other organizations in your community in the form of grants or gifts, you're not allowed to do that. You can pay third-party vendors for services provided, but you're not able to re-grant the funds that you've received. On this notion of prepaying 2021 expenses, there was some question around that, and we had some questions in our Tuesday session. The general principle is that you can only use these funds for the 2020 portion of those expenses. So if you paid 12 months worth of insurance back in July, you can only use the first 6 months of that expense, or half of the total bill. If you're paying for a contract for services that are going to run into 2021, you can only use that for the expenses that are being incurred in 2020. Everything has to be captured from March 1st through December 30th of 2020. I know we had a lot of question around that on Tuesday. So be sure in your reporting that you're only capturing 2020 expenditures. We can't have this overlap or run over into 2021. The grant forms, if you haven't been able to find them, or if you didn't get the email or you've struggled to find the grant, you will go to covidrelief.mt.gov/login. This is the same place that you would go to find the grant proposals or the grant applications, same place you go to apply for the grant. There's a spot there to log in. Once you log in, you'll see in the top right corner, we'll have your name. You click your name, you'll see My Submissions. Click on My Submissions, go into the grant that you received. This is the exact same place where you applied for the grant, the same place where you sign the contract that says we accept the grant, where you submitted your W-9 and your EFT, any of that information. Within that portal at the top, there's a tab that says Forms. On the Forms tab, you'll see the option of submitting your interim report. At this point in time, it just says interim report. If you're going to end up doing a second report by January 31st, you'll get another email at some point before that says your final report is now posted, and you can go in and fill that out. The person who filled out your grant application for your organization is going to be the person who got the email that says you have the report, and that's the person, that's the profile that you need to log into to find the report. For your organization, if multiple people submitted grants, CRF grant applications, multiple people are going to get the for different grants, are going to get the email to be able to go in and submit for these forms. So it's the person who submitted the proposal that's where you'll find the grant form, the grant reporting form. So we're going to get to questions here in a second, but know that we here at MNA are trying to provide as much help as we can to make sure that you do this right and that you have all your questions answered. So we have a Coronavirus Relief Fund reporting resource page that we have stood up that had the links for these town halls. We'll have the recordings for these town halls. It also has a link to sign up for a 30-minute help desk session with us here at MNA. We've also partnered with a couple of our great accounting firms that are here in Montana, Anderson, Zemulin, and Wipfli. They have both signed up and said if any organizations have accounting challenges trying to figure out how to run a general ledger report, or how to on the back end sort of go in and account for all of the funds that they've received, whether it was PPP or CRF funds or multiple CRF funds, CRF grants. If you need that level of accounting detail, how to run reports or do the accounting, they have said we're ready and willing to help in whatever way we can. But to sort of expedite that process, we're asking that if you'd like to access that support, go through MNA first. We'll try to help you. And if we can't help you, we will refer you to either Anderson, Zemulin, or Wipfli to provide that expertise, to provide that help. And your work with them, they're going to make that as absolutely as affordable as possible, but there will be some fees associated with that. Just know the fees that they're going to be charging for that, for their limited amount of time, is well worth your money to get this done right and not to have a payback on the back end. So please, if you have any question or any doubt at all about whether you're able to get this done and get this done accurately, reach out to us and let us reach out to either AZ or Wipfli to ensure that you're getting the support you need to get this done right. If you also have questions for us that are non-accounting related, we will answer them if we can. And if we're not able to answer them, we will get questions or get answers from the state of Montana. We've already gotten quite a few answered questions from our Tuesday session. On our COVID relief page, we're building an FAQ that has your questions and our answers as we're getting them. In addition to that, it also has your questions that we're unable to answer as of yet. So continue to check that webpage out, and we're updating that regularly as we get answers in from the state of Montana so that you have what you need to fill out these reports as needed. That, I think, if I'm correct, that's sort of the gist of the program. Did that in about 20 minutes, which is good. The rest of our time, we just want to spend answering your questions as you have them and making sure you feel comfortable getting in and filling out those reports. So I am going to turn it back to Shelby and Michael, and let's get some questions.
Adam, I have been trying to hit most of those in the chat. So if you have posted a question at this point, I think we've gotten most of those.
Okay.
I do have one from Claire that I don't think no, I think I got to Claire's question. Let me double check and see if there's one that I'm missing. We received a food bank and social services round 2 grant, but the interim report only appears on the submission for the food bank grant. We've not received funds for round 2 yet. If the form does not appear in the round 2 grant submission, are we required to submit a report?
Okay, yes, you will be required. And I know the state is working through, there are some folks who haven't received the funds yet for round 2 of social service. And I know that they're trying to get those out the door as quickly as they can, which may be why you haven't received the request to submit your report yet. But if you can, we're making a note of those because there have been a couple other instances of folks who've not received the form. And if you will make a note of your comment as well, and we will make sure the state of Montana is aware of it. And if they need to issue that report to you, great. Otherwise, know that your final report is due by January 31st. So you've got time. And obviously, if you haven't received the funds yet, there's no way for you to have spent it yet or account for that spending. So just know that if you haven't received it yet, you will. And the deadline is going to be January 31st for the final accounting of all grant funds.
Great. We had another question about sharing the presentation. And yes, that this is being recorded and it will be posted to our website under resources for this particular reporting.
Yep, as will the Tuesday session. And I know it's a lot to wade through, but we had, we were probably on for 90 minutes on Tuesday answering questions. So your question may have been asked and answered on Tuesday. If it's not in the FAQ, and if it's not answered here today, that's another resource for you to check out as well, that recording.
Okay. Sage, if you want to grab the microphone to ask your question, this would be an appropriate time.
Thank you. So I know my intention is not to double dip, but I have two organizations that work hand in hand. They each have their own EIN number, but one of the organization, all the payroll's done out of one organization. So one organization's reimbursing the other to do the payroll.
Okay.
So maybe you got this question on Tuesday, but I can't get the numbers to match on the general ledger because then it would be like doubling up on the funds. Does that make sense? Like if the one organization is reimbursed, like, so say the payroll's $60,000 for the executive director and it's a 50-50 split. So one organization's paying $30,000. Great, I submit that on one grant, but on the other general ledger, it's going to show $60,000, but that's not really true with that organization spent because there was reimbursement from a different one.
Sure. Okay. But okay. I think I understand what you're getting at.
Because then it looks like I'm doubling. I don't want to claim 90,000 because that's not fair.
Correct.
When it's a reimbursement.
Yeah, there may be a way to sort of, that's a good question, Sage. And I think maybe we can set up some time after this to go over it.
Okay.
And just talk about the mechanics of that. I think this is going to take some accounting mechanics to get that figured out so that we're able to run two GLs or some semblance of two general ledgers that show accurately the payroll costs for each organization. And then maybe where we need to bring in some support to get that done.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you want to I did sign up for
a session. Yeah, Sage, if you wanted to just either shoot me an email.
Okay.
If you can, and we'll find some time to get that done.
Okay. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Jess asks, there is a statement under the general ledger upload on the report that says the amount you input in the buckets should match what the general ledger says. If this is an interim report and you're not uploading a general ledger, should you still fill in those boxes with the pre-9/30 expenditures you've made?
Yes, for the interim report, you want to fill out the expenditures that you've spent to date within those buckets. So it's going to say how much have you spent for payroll, how much have you spent for equipment, how much have you spent for supplies, and then it's got some other categories, and you get to define what other means. You need to, right now, at this point for an interim report, go in and fill out into those buckets how much money you've spent for each of those. Once it comes time, you're going to end up doing basically the same report for the final report, but the final report is also going to then include the general ledger, which shows the detailed transactions showing where you spent all of the money in each of those buckets, and it will match sort of the summary that you put into the form. So at this point, yeah, you want to go through and detail what you spent to date, knowing that you're going to have to come back and redo that and then add to it for the final report.
Mm-hmm. Adam, I have a question for Dixie, but it's about the actual mechanics of the submittable website. Okay. Working with that. So I did post the support at submittable in the chat. So if you're having difficulty interfacing and filling out your report, just email them there.
Yes. Yeah. And that's guidance we've received from the state. They don't manage the portal itself. They've contracted that out to Submittable, which is a company here in Montana. So if you have any sort of computer problems or tech problems with the actual mechanics of that, email Submittable directly.
Can you define obligated funds? Does that refer only to things like invoices that haven't yet been paid, or does that also refer to budgeted non-variable items like payroll?
No, it's yeah, and that's the portion that says how much have you obligated and plan to spend by the end of the year. So that's if you've got the invoice but it hasn't been paid yet, that's obligated. That's also where we anticipate, where you're telling the state, we anticipate we're going to get these funds spent by December 30th. So that's your chance to detail your plan for how funds are going to be spent, or if funds are going to be spent by the end of the year.
Kelly is asking if you could go over the contracted services timeframe.
Contracted services timeframe, I would say that's the timeframe for all of this is March 1st through December 30th. So if you have signed a contract for services provided that, let's say you signed it for September and it's going to go to next March, you're only allowed to use that portion of expenses that are within the 9 months we're talking about, March through December. I think that's answering your question. If we need to rephrase that, please give us a little more.
Jody's asking about purchased equipment that is under 5,000. Is this eligible as an expense? It is non-expendable.
That, our interpretation, the definition that the state has provided is that a piece of capital equipment is anything over $5,000, which may be different than your capital asset policy within your organization, but we're going with the $5,000 threshold for the state of Montana. So if it's under 5,000, consider it a supply.
Robin is asking for a confirmation. They have a $10,000 round one, and they have a round two grant. That's a total of 25. So that makes 35. And then they also have a business innovation grant at 25,000. My understanding from today is no interim report is due for business innovation, and no ledger report is required from the 25,000 round two grant that does require an interim report. Thanks for confirming.
So the business innovation grants, again, are not being administered by the Department of Health and Human Services. And I do not know if any other departments, I think it might be done by Commerce. I don't know if any other departments are doing interim reports. So you're right. There's probably, if you haven't received an email that says you have an interim report due for that grant, there's probably not going to be an interim report due. You probably just have to do the final report by the end of January. It looks like total you have $50,000 on the nose in CRF funds, meaning that for your final reports, when the final reports are due on January 31st, you will have to submit a general ledger report for your social service grant, 25,000, and your business innovation grant, 25,000. But no general ledger is due for the interim report that you're doing for social service.
Did the state answer the question regarding whether or not we're tied to the buckets of spending and exact amounts in our applications?
You've got latitude. You need to ensure that you're staying within your contract, that you're only using eligible expenses, that those expenses are to mitigate impacts of COVID. But you've got some latitude if it doesn't match, exactly as what you had put into your original application. So you've got that latitude.
Sonia's asking a question, and I'm not sure what she means. How do we get approval for purchases over 5,000?
Again, the approval was the fact that you received the grant for the purpose in which you had applied for it. You need to be sure, and this is something I got some clarification on from the state just today, that any major purchases that you are incurring is something that is necessary for COVID mitigation. So you can't just use it to buy something to sort of better the organization, or it has to be something that is related to COVID impact for your organization, or related to the grant that you had applied for. So if it's a food bank, maybe you needed to expand capacity by buying a freezer or buying something like that. That's related to COVID response and COVID mitigation. It can't be just to build a new wing on your building just because you wanted to, just because you need a place to spend funds. So you're approved. If you need further approval, You can send an email to the state of Montana. I think there's an email, it's relief something at mt.gov. You can also email me the detail, and I can forward it on just to make sure that that's something that will be approved. But just know that if it needs to fit in the list of eligible expenses, and it needs to be related to the spirit of your grant, which was for COVID response and COVID mitigation. And it can only be for the portion of that capital expenditure that you are expensing as an expense in 2020.
We received social services nonprofit grant funds this month, but the expenses covered by the grant were actually incurred and paid prior to September 30th. Can we just file one report and call it our final?
Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. You can use it for expenses going back to March 1st, regardless of when you receive the funds. So if you've gotten the funds and you can account for expenses that are unfunded, or, they don't have other COVID CARES Act funding tied to those, you can fill out the grant and be done.
Adam, can you give an example of how funds can't overlap with funding received? You mentioned the PPP. Can you go over that requirement of the grant funds again?
Yes. So the general rule is that you can't double dip on uses for any CARES Act funding. So any of the funding that came from that big umbrella, the big federal program, which included, for most of us, the thing that's most applicable is the Paycheck Protection Program loans. You have to make sure that you are not tying individual unique expenses to the same grant fund or loan fund, I guess, because the Paycheck Protection Program was a loan. So if you, at my example from prior, if you use the PPP loan for payroll, rent, and utilities for a certain time frame, any CRF funds that you've received since, even if you're going to use it for payroll, rent, and utilities, can't be for that exact same time frame. It has to be after or before, if there was some time before March 1st or after March 1st. So you just need to make sure that on your transaction report, even though you're not submitting our transaction report for the PPP, you had to submit that to get PPP forgiveness. And within this grant fund, you need to make sure that it's not overlapping with funds that you've said, hey, this dollar was spent by paid for by PPP funds. This expense was covered by PPP, and this expense was covered by CRF. Hopefully that makes sense.
Sorry, I muted myself because my dog was barking. Amy is asking, just follow up, do the expenses, except for payroll, have to be directly COVID related, or can they still include general supplies and expenses, things that would go in that more general operating category for the smaller things that are not those large capital purchases?
Yeah. Yes, you can pay for those general supplies and expenses, because those often, the spirit of this is that it was to make organizations whole from being negatively impacted from COVID lockdowns and the COVID pandemic in general. So if you had lost revenue and you're using this to sort of backfill that revenue to cover general operating supplies and expenses and rent and utilities and payroll and those types of things for the core mission that you're carrying out, that's fine. If you're talking about any sort of expansion or any sort of growth or new facility or new system or new whatever, that needs to be directly related to how is this helping you with COVID response and COVID mitigation in your community. But for those social service grants, yeah, it was meant to make organizations as whole as possible for the negative revenue reductions that they had due to COVID response, due to the coronavirus lockdowns.
Are you able to count prepaid expenses for bills coming up in January, February? And if you have a one-year contract, are you able to count that expense if the contract carries over from 2020 into 2021?
No, you can't count any prepaid expenses for anything that's going to be for anything that's going to be an expense. Put it as an expense on your income statement into 2021, January, February, or after that. if you have a 1-year contract that spans past 2020 into 2021, you can only use that portion of the contract expense that's within 2020. That's within March 1st through December 30th. So we can't have any expenses that are overlapping into 2021.
And that is the end of the questions in the chat. If we missed one, just grab the microphone and just speak out your question. That would be helpful. One just came in from Joan. Is the employer portion of FICA Medicare the only payroll tax that's not allowed? Are any other payroll related costs like unemployment, et cetera, unallowed?
Our understanding is that it's just the payroll taxes, just the federal taxes. So those other ones I think would be allowed. I think it goes back to the definition of CARES Act with the CARES Act and the PPP, which allowed for a more broad interpretation of those taxes. Meaning, yeah, everything except for the employer portion of taxes, the FICA, is an allowable expense. That said, it's a question that keeps coming up, and I want to make sure we're crystal clear with our answer. So we'll probably end up posting the exact language from the state on that question on the FAQ on our website.
If they needed to purchase more computers for employees to be able to work remotely, is that expense covered?
Within yeah, it's an eligible expense. It's considered a supply that is related to COVID mitigation, COVID response. So that would be allowable and coverable here.
And do we need to consider, it's CACFP, I'm not sure what that stands for, reimbursements for the food program when considering grant overlaps?
I don't know what that is. If that was a CARES Act, if that was CARES Act funding, if that was something that came out of that congressional bill that either boosted payments for organizations or provided new payments for organizations, or reimbursements, I should say, then that would be considered part of the overlap. Any dollar that came out of the CARES Act can't sort of double dip. So that's something, not knowing a little more about that, I think that's probably the case.
I think I also have some clarification. If it's state or federal dollars, then it cannot overlap.
Yep.
I think that's the more general answer.
Yep.
Could you prepay for your 2020 tax return and be considered an allowable expense?
I don't think so. If it's an expense that you're going to incur after this calendar year, right? That work is going to be done in 2021. I would not consider that allowable.
Anything else?
And Gina, I'm reading your chat where you said it's monthly payments that you get for meals served to children. Again, to Michael's comment, if it's state or federal dollars, I would make sure that it's not overlapping. You're not having any kind of overlap.
Can the funding be used to hire personnel to help with SNAP, other acronym?
TAMP. Yep. I believe so. Yeah. I mean, that's personnel that, to me, that feels like it's not knowing your context. I mean, that feels like you're ramping up to help in your community with COVID response, COVID mitigation. Personnel is an allowable expense as long as you're not paying for payroll taxes. That seems like it's allowable.
Can you talk about triggering a single audit?
Single audit, yeah. So the law says that if you have received more than $750,000 in federal funds in a single calendar year, single fiscal year, that triggers a single audit where you actually have to have your books audited by an outside accounting firm. The PPP loans do not count towards that, but other CARES Act funding does, including all of the CRF funds that we're talking about here. So if that pushes you, so if you to date between your any kind of federal grants you've received, federal contracts, CRF funds, Some of those other buckets, if that pushes you over $750,000 for the first time, you're going to be required to audit your books at the end of this year. That's going to sort of bump you above that threshold. So we might try to put some resource on that on our COVID response website, and more to come on that in the future. And we will post clarification on the payroll expenses on our CRF reporting website. It'll be one of the questions and answers on the FAQ on our CRF reporting site.
And that's all I see. Adam, I don't know if you might want to speak to if the organization is looking at a shortfall and the possibility of having to return some funds. Are there ways that they could think within their own programming about how they might have some expenses where they wouldn't actually have to return that money back? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and first, just know that a payback, although it's definitely no fun, it's not like you're being penalized. There's no penalty for it. In addition to it, going above and beyond having to pay the money back, you're just saying, hey, we weren't able to ramp up like we thought we would, or spend the funds like we thought we would. So it's not the end of the world if that were to happen. That said, you do have some latitude as an organization to figure out, well, how do we account for all these expenses? One thing to think about is, if you have maybe temporarily restricted foundation dollars that have gone towards certain programming, if you're able to talk with that foundation and get that restriction removed so that you could sort of carry those funds over into the future, which sort of frees up a new bucket of expense that you can use for CRF funds. That's one response, or other donor restricted funds you may have, or even if you have general operating funds you're able to carry forward to be able to use CRF funds for those expenses. That's something to consider. And yeah, there's a lot on the table there. And I think that's where if you are struggling to figure out how do you account for all of it and how do you make it all work on your books, that's the time to reach out to us, and probably to let us connect you with Wipfli or Andersons or Mullen to take a deeper dive and figure out how, if there's a way to get that all done that maintains the spirit of all the grants that you've applied for, it doesn't overlap, and allows you to maximize your return and not have to have a payback. So that's the time where it will be money well spent to get that done.
We've got a question from Jill. She has submitted for 3 food banks with different grant IDs, and she assumes that she's going to report on all 3 separately, even though they share a tax ID. And even though the 3 combined were over 50,000, will she report on each of their own amounts granted? Does that make sense?
I think so. You will submit the same number of reports that you submitted grant applications for. So if it was 3 food banks, but it was submitted under one grant application, you'll do one joint grant report. If you did 3 applications for all 3 food banks, even though they may have had the same tax ID, you're going to end up with 3 reports. As far as what triggers the general ledger, I would say that's where, if in doubt, let's move towards being more cautious. And if the combined sum goes over 50,000, I would just count on doing a GL for all 3 of those. I don't think it would be that difficult. I think that it would cover your base as well.
Anything else? All right, Adam.
Yeah, and I would lastly, even if you've spent all the funds to date, if you're having a hard time creating that general ledger report and getting everything to tie together, it's easy enough just to submit this as an interim report without a GL and get that GL done by January 31st. So if you're not able to get it done in the next 4 days, don't sweat it. You've got time. And you've got a couple months to get that figured out. And we and our friends at AZ and Wipfli are here as resources for that if you need us. But if you're able to get it done now, I do know the state is appreciative of all those grants they can close out today for sure. Okay, thank you, everybody. Best luck to you all. Reach out to us with any questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. We will be posting this recording and slides on our COVID relief page, and we'll be updating our FAQ page definitely by the end of the day tomorrow. We'll try to have as many answers as we can for questions that have been asked. And so keep checking that as you have questions. All right. Bye, everybody.